What's fascinating about a championship team is, and we've talked about this before on this podcast, but what's fascinating about a championship team is there are different aspects that makes a championship team, but there are stark similarities. And I think the beauty in basketball is, again, you can win different ways, but dominance looks like something, and you get to it. Dominance isn't an overnight thing. You have to build towards dominance, and once you get there, it is obvious and it is clear what dominance looks like. What I think is I'm going to talk about obviously UConn winning the national championship and South Carolina winning the national championship. What I'm going to start with obviously is South Carolina, but what's fascinating to me is how similar both these teams look and how both these teams kind of model a brand of success, a dominant brand of success, might I add. You see, players matter. Okay, I'm never going to say that players aren't important. You need players to execute the scheme, execute your game plan. If you don't have good players, you don't have a good team. That's just paramount. Like that's obvious. Players are extremely important for the success of a team. But what I think is so fascinating about let's stick with South Carolina is how important Don Staley is to not only this year's team, but the culture of South Carolina. People are looking at South Carolina now the same way that they looked at Gina Auriemma's UConn, the same way that they looked at Pat Summitt's Tennessee. And there's a reason for that. Obviously, yes, there is a sense of dominance that we're seeing with South Carolina. Don Staley winning her third national championship as a coach, being the first African American woman to actually win 3 national championships as a coach. So shouts out to her. But yes, players matter. And yes, you need players to execute your game plan. That's obvious. But when we talk about a culture of winning, one of the underestimated qualities that you need as a coach is you need to be able to build a winning culture. You can be a good. In fact, I will attest and I will combat anyone that says that a good coach. How do I say this? I think that you cannot be a good coach if you don't build a winning culture. Now, also, I understand that there are some coaches that don't have the players to implement a winning culture, but you can see a winning culture. And you can see a culture that is built off winning. You just don't have the pieces for it. I think that's different. I think it's clear as day that you have the culture, you just don't win because the players might not be up to stuff, maybe because teams around you are better. That's different than having a culture. And what I think Dawn Staley has done is she has brought a winning formula. She has brought a winning culture to South Carolina. Mind you, South Carolina, I'm not saying they were trash, but they really weren't good. There wasn't a culture of winning before she got there. And now when you look up, she's won her third national championship since 2017. They're one of the most highly recruited teams on the women's side in the NCAA. When you look, they always have a exceptional pool of players. And I think that is a gift and a curse, if you ask me a little bit. because it just makes your job that much harder. It makes your job when you get a Destiny Henderson, when you get a Aaliyah Boston, when you get an Asia Wilson, when you get Camila Cardoza, they're gonna be gone. Now, obviously, with the women's game, they have to stay a little longer due to the rules, but that it just you constantly have to reinvent yourself. You constantly have to reinvent your team, or your team is gonna fall by the wayside. And that is where the winning culture comes in. We don't talk about that much in college basketball. We're going to talk about a coach later on in this show that I don't know if he's a great coach, but I don't know if he brings a winning culture. It might be controversial, but we'll talk about it a little later. But you cannot say that about Don Staley and this South Carolina team. Yo, they had an undefeated season. I think they went 38-0. Do you know how tough that is? You know how they say any given Sunday on football? Well, that's exactly how it is in basketball as well. You can lose to anyone. Someone can have a great game and you just don't have it. They had 38 opportunities to lose and they didn't lose once. I think that this goes way beyond congratulations for Don Staley and for the South Carolina Gamecocks. Yo, I it's been talked about all year, and we saw the peak of it in this tournament. The women's game has surpassed the men's game at least this year. Or you know what? I'll say the last few years. I'm not saying that this is going to be a trend and it's going to continue this way, but a lot of the reason is because of Caitlin Clark, and a lot of reason is because basketball is about storylines. We talked about this last episode, I believe. Basketball is about storylines, and there's more compelling, more intriguing storylines with the women's side than it is the men's. And you also saw a dominant force. I think that's kind of what gets lost in this as well. While yes, Caitlin Clark was incredible, there were some incredible freshmen this year in college basketball, whether we talk about Hannah Adalgo. You know, there were players that weren't freshmen but were still great, like Paige Beckers. Another freshman was Juju Watkins. You know, there were some great players. But there was also that dominant force, and that dominant force was South Carolina. And as we saw, you know what I think it is? You know how people say they don't like dynasties, and you know how people say that they don't like they don't like the Alabamas. You know how Alabama wins a lot of, usually they're amongst the top football teams. It hasn't been that in a few years, but you know how people say that they don't like watching the dominance of Alabama, yet and still the viewership for Alabama games are amongst some of the highest every season in college football? A lot of people said that they don't like a dominant team. They don't like a quote-unquote dynasty. They don't like a team that is just head and shoulders above the rest. Yet and still, South Carolina was one of the most watched teams all year, one of the most followed teams all year. And they brought that dominance to the national championship and essentially beat out Caitlin Clark and the Iowa Hawkeyes, which, by the way, you know, a lot of people are talking about how great Caitlin Clark is. Well, Iowa is a pretty good team. This is their second year in a row. Unfortunately, they lost, but their second year in a row making the national championship. It's crazy, man. And I think the beauty of it is Don Staley in this South Carolina team, while it's easy to hate because, again, a lot of people like to see people lose. But I think that they're also easy to love. Don Staley probably is one of the most genuine people, at least, I don't know her personally, obviously, but at least from the outside looking in. She's one of the most genuine people to follow, genuine people to wrap your arms around. And it's not just from the outside looking in. You can see by the recruiting, and you can see by all the former players that just speak glowing of her, and all her current players that speak glowing of her.
Oh man, you stayed to the end of the video. I appreciate you. If you like what you saw, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you'll never miss any content from your boy. You can also go back and watch past episodes, past clips, and don't forget that the Unpopular Podcast new episodes drop every Wednesday and Saturday. Appreciate you.